So now it's just seeing me. There we go. So, welcome everybody, and let's start magnificently. I won't spend a long time talking about it, but it's so important. We're going to spend an hour together, hour and a half, and we're going to make karma. So let's make it a splendid, wonderful, and powerful karma. And that depends on your motivation, your mind. It depends on your initial motivation, how we launch into this teaching, why we're doing it. And then it also depends, as we go through the talk, on how well you're attending, and how, not just how well you're listening and trying to get the ideas, but listening with an openness because you really love the Dharma, you really want to understand these teachings as best you can, and you care for everybody, all sentient beings. And you know that the best way you can help them, and I can help them, is by having a clear mind. And as these teachings are about what mind is, then we are absolutely fascinated, loving them, and wanting to drink in every drop like it's food. So let's turn our hearts in loving care and think we are having this Zoom meeting together for the benefit of everyone, and in particular, in order to develop our own wisdom, our own compassion, our own true peace with ourselves, with everybody inside. Sonje chodam soje chonam la jancho bodo dane chapsunje. Dagi jinso jipe sonam je rola penchara sonje druparan sho. Samchen tamje dewa dang dewe judam temparan choche. Dungal dang dungal ji judam kralwara choche. Dungal me pen dewa tampa dang men kralwara choche. Nyeren chadan etang kralwe. Tanyom Chempola Neparan Juranchi. Kaldan Sawe Lama Rinpoche Dagye Chevora Pende Denshona. Kadrin Chempo Gone Jesonte Koson Projim Adrot Sandu Swal. Thank you. Well, what an adventure. Consciousness and primordial wisdom covers everything of what we call the world, everything of the spiritual path, everything of enlightenment. So all the Buddha's 45 years of teaching are about this. And we have 4 hours, 1 hour gone. And this morning I have a lot in mind I'd like to share. Let's see how we get on. In theory, we're following the 3rd Karmapa's text. And so for the blessing of it, let's start there. Although today we won't be spending a lot of time with the verses. There are some things I need to explain so we have the ideas straight before we go into what are the most complicated verses of this teaching. So today, not so much in the way of verses, but you should have downloaded the backup material. And so last week we did 2 verses of the 36 or whatever. And today we might do 3 if we're lucky. So in English, some believe that the 3 realms and their beings. Oh, stop, explain. 3 realms. 3 realms, 3 dimensions of existence. One is often translated, I don't like it, as the sense dimension, the sense realm, no, desire realm, that's what it's translated at. I think you've seen that. And actually the word in Tibetan durpa, which means desire, actually also it has six meanings, that word. And one of them is durpa, it means the object of your senses. So durpa, what you see, like we had last week, what you see, what you hear, what you smell, taste, and what your body feels. So we're in that kind of a realm. Our experience that comes to us all the time comes through the senses. And then when we're not working through the senses and we're remembering and turning over ideas, that's based on the senses. If you think elephant, you need to have seen a picture of an elephant with your eyes before you can think elephant with any meaning. Otherwise, it's just a nonsense word. So we're in that kind of realm. Many of the gods, demigods, humans, animals, spirits, hell beings, they're all in sensorial experience. Happier, worse. So that's called, in my translation, that's called the sensorial dimension. Not desire realm, the sensorial dimension. And then you get the form realm. The form realm is not primarily sensorial. It's a realm of meditation and absorption, where the mind is not distracted by the senses. It is literally absorbed, gone, pickled in meditation, somewhere in some state of peace, peace with bliss, without bliss, mental bliss, physical bliss, with analysis, without all sorts of levels of what we call shamatha, absorption. But what's not happening primarily is sensorial existence. The mind is within. The mind is collected within. It is stable within. And there are various levels of this. And so that's called the form dimension, or the form realm. And then there's another level of meditation where you are very gone. And there aren't those forms of shamatha. So there are 4 key formless states of meditation, which are possibilities. So the sensorial realm, form realm, and formless realm. So that covers all existence, all samsara. So some believe that all of those and the beings who experience them are creations arising from self, or from other, or from both, or from no cause. We might come back to that. If we have 2 or 3 months, we might come back to that and understand it. But anyway, it's middle way philosophy. So some believe that beings are created, that they exist. They really exist. And some state that there is a God, a creator. Some make it all sorts of names here: Shiva, Brahma, Vishnu, Gampocha. Or that externally there are atoms, a world of mind and matter, or imperceptible matter like ether and so on. And they truly exist. Truly exist. Of which both oneself and this world we experience are created. But the unique one, the omniscient one, the Buddha, taught that these 3 realms are simply, purely, nothing more than mind. It's chitta matra in Sanskrit. The matra means simply, purely, only mind, merely mind. They are derived neither of themselves, neither of other, neither a combination of both, neither of something different than that. Everything happens through interdependence. They are by their very nature void, utterly free from being single or multiple, utterly free from being false or true, like the reflection of the moon in water. And knowing this, the Buddha taught it to all beings. So then, from what source does delusion or lack of delusion arise? And then this next, the end of this verse from the Karmapa is, I don't know, is powerful. He says, I have understood. So when a teacher gives a teaching like this, sometimes they're simply quoting the Buddha and passing on the message, which is what he's doing in one way, but he's also saying, I got it. He's Karmapa. He is Buddha in our world. So he says, I have understood the nature of dependent origination in the same way that one sees one's reflection in a mirror, or one knows that there is fire because there's smoke behind the hill. And I shall clearly describe it here. So there, the Karmapa is referring to two things. The one where he says, like looking in a mirror, is about ultimate truth, because the Karmapa is Buddha, has realized and stabilized and is the Buddha mind. So in that mind, as we'll see in the last talk, there is the mirror-like wisdom in which, without any limit, without anything unknown, all realities throughout time and space are known in the awakened mind. They are clear, nothing is hidden. So Karmapa knows from his direct experience all of the relative and the ultimate. But not only that, he knows relative existence through the Buddha's teaching of logic, and in particular, the teachings of karma, cause and effect. And so just like we know, if we see smoke coming up from behind the hill, somebody must have lit a fire on the other side, even though you can't see the fire, then he has mastered the traditional teachings about causality, and they make total sense to him. So based on this thorough mastery of the traditional things, of the relative truth that can be put into words and communicated through words, he is teaching, but he's also teaching through his own enlightened mirror-like wisdom, which he can't communicate. The Karmapa, unfortunately, can't sort of get you and bzz, like this with mirror-like wisdom, and then you go, wow, I got it too. That would save us years, lifetimes, tens of lifetimes of hard work. So the Karmapa is telling us where he gets what he's going to tell us about. Now, within that, first let me give you the transmission from the Tibetan. So you imagine you're receiving this from the third Karmapa, because it's in his language, his original words. Kamsum semchen tamchene, da dan shen dan nikadan, jumelene jungwaratok, chepo, chadan, wanchukdan, sangdan chamjuk, shiroduk, shana mui, zedente, daltan jikten jeche ma, tamche chenpa, nya chi ni, kamsum vida semchente, dale mayen shenlene, nile mayen ju me nen, chernam tenchin dro chung, te dene drangi motom, chik dan tate namdrawa, zun dan denpa namfangshin, juma chuda lasoktar, chenne semchen namnasom. Now, when I studied the content of the verses we just read, took 5 solid months of study, and it goes very deep. Now, it all hinges around the idea of exist and to be born, as we find those words in the texts and in the philosophy. And unfortunately, due to translation, there is a lot of misunderstanding. A lot. The first month of the study of what Karmapa is referring to in that verse is about arising, being born. And I'm sure when you look at profound texts, you come across this word, unborn. And it makes some kind of sense to you. Of course, you can read a word like that, and it will make whatever sense it makes. But what does it really mean? It's a denial of the idea that people of all sorts and philosophies and religions have, that something exists, truly exists. Now, in the old philosophies of India, where all this started, if something exists, it doesn't mean this word exists, which in Tibetan is yu, beautiful word, yu. Please say it, even don't turn on your microphones, but just say it, yu. If something yu, it exists. It means it exists in its own right. It doesn't depend on anything else to be what it is. It is. The implications of that are enormous. If something is in its own right, you know, very much like the way, perhaps this is familiar to you, the way Christians think of God. God is, always has been, always will be. So if were God to be true, God would exist. Yeah. If God depended on anything to exist, then he wouldn't exist. He might exist in the terms of the English language for millions of years, come and go, but that's not yu. When something yu, it exists in its own right, and because it depends on nothing else, it has to be eternal. And that's the Buddha's teaching. Anything that depends on causes and conditions is impermanent, comes and goes. So various faiths at the time of Buddha, and then later at the time of the great Buddhist philosophers, have an idea of something that exists, whether it be God, like he says, Brahma or Vishnu, or whether it be what we might call the universe, some kind of passive potential that can give rise to anything. Not necessarily a somebody like Brahma or Vishnu, but a something, but that has always been there, exists. Now, if something exists, then in human thinking, it has to come into being. And one of the questions, even the question that children ask is, well, if God made the world, who made God? This kind of question. Where did it come from? So the idea of arising, coming into being, is linked with existence. And there are various variants of that. Some have the idea of creation or arising or coming into being as happening in a sort of closed circle. Like there is God and everything is God, but also God creates us and we come and go, but we're all part of God. It's like the waves of an ocean. but there is the ocean. So that creation is not creation of something other, but it's creations within itself. Some have got those kind of ideas of like Purusha, great cosmic potential and so on. Many ideas, creation from self. Some have the idea of creation from other. So God creates a world. There's the world, one thing, God's another thing. Some have got a mixture of those two. One example that I give is like a clay pot on a potter's wheel. It's actually the clay that forms the pot, but without the shaping of the potter, it won't be a pot, it will just be mud. And that there's kind of God who's other, but also the same substance. There's all sorts of fiddly ways humans can think. So some combination of self and other. And then the last part, they're the ones who fudge it and they say it's a mystery. We'll never know, but it's not from self, not from other, not from a mixture of self and other, or Allah, but something's going on. Don't quite know what. Huge mystery. So in philosophy, in Buddhism, we explore these. We explore the different traditions of spiritual thought that were current in the times of early Buddhism. It's kind of interesting, but what's really interesting for us and what people are doing now is to compare the Buddhist thought with our modern thinking, modern philosophy, modern science, and so on. So anyway, all of those months and months of study in detail, and by developing an absolutely infallible logic and a system of debate, a whole raft of terminology, so that when one person talks, they know clearly what the other person's talking about. We can't touch, we don't have time. That's all I can do as far as mention it. But you do need to know very, very clearly that when Buddhist texts say, for instance, self doesn't exist, it doesn't mean we don't exist in the normal human sense of the term. Of course we exist, relatively and interdependently and impermanently. If something exists in the very precise sense of those Buddhist texts, then it exists lastingly, not impermanently, and it exists relying on nothing else to be what it is. It is. So when Buddha says self does not exist, it means we have no lasting, timeless, cosmic soul or self. We are changing all the time according to causes and conditions. Now, I want now to leave the text and to develop. We're on a Zoom talk, so I want to zoom in, and without turning on your microphones, can you just wave your hand if the audio is clear still? It hasn't dropped. It's okay? Good, thank you. Yeah, I want to zoom in and introduce a few important notions today that will come up in the following verses and that are our need to know for this topic of consciousness and wisdom. So first, the big picture is that there are two things running parallel right now, in you, in me. So the Karmapa just told us everything is mind. And let's use that word, mind, in English, chitta in Sanskrit. I think there's a microphone on. Okay, I just turned everyone off again. So chitta is the word for mind. Everything is mind. Now, last week we touched very briefly on what is consciousness, the stuff that presents itself, that's on screen, each moment in my mind, your mind. So everything is mind does not mean everything is consciousness. So as far as mind, chitta, is concerned, we have two things running parallel. And these two things are nothing to do with each other at all. One is the truth of mind, the true nature. We say now Buddha nature when we talk about ourselves. Mind in its primordial, changeless clarity, infinite love, power to help beings, and total peace. That's always been there. Will always there now, right now, here now. Will always be there as the truth of mind. And running parallel with that and masking that truth, all that is consciousness. The stream of consciousness that is never interrupted, even when you are fainting, even when you die. That stream of consciousness continues. It's your story, it's my story. It will only end when we become a perfect, totally enlightened Buddha. And until we practice powerful meditation, that stream of consciousness masks, occults, blocks off awareness of the truth of our mind, our Buddha nature. So the first thing is we must be very clear. These two things running parallel. The truth of ourselves, Buddha nature, the truth of everything. And then the stream of consciousness, which is the movie that you're experiencing uniquely as your life. I'm experiencing as my life. That's the second thing. Now that stream of consciousness, the next step, has 6 main modes. Like imagine you've got your flashing Christmas lights, right? And you've got a remote control, and you can have 6 different possibilities. They're either flash, flash, or else they're running a line of light, whatever they're doing. 6 possibilities. Consciousness has 6 possibilities, and we call them the 6 Bardos. You probably come across this word, Bardo. It means in between. So let's take 2 of them, which are the waking state and sleep and dream. Just now we're awake, I hope. I can't see you all, but I think we're awake. But then tonight we will sleep. It's a very different manifestation of consciousness to the waking state. It has some possibilities we don't have in the waking state, but then it lacks some of the possibilities also we have when we're awake. It's another mode of consciousness. So just now we're between last night's sleep and tonight's sleep. We're in between. We're in the waking state, Bardo. And then when we're dreaming and so sleeping tonight, we're in between waking state consciousness and waking state consciousness the next day. So we have this never-ending stream of consciousness with its 6 modes. And when we're in one, we're between that and some of the others. We're constantly in betweening. You'll sleep tonight and you'll be awake tomorrow. So what are these 6 possible and quite different in their nature, in their quality, manifestations of consciousness? 6 Bardos. 3 of them are possible while we're awake and human. Oh, that's my clock. It's 11 o'clock here. So quite quiet. So 1 is waking state. Another is sleep, including dream when it happens, or sleep and dream. And the third one is awakened meditation. I don't know what to call the third one. It's when your mind is aware of the Buddha mind. So it's very deep meditation, very accomplished meditation. of the primordial nature of mind, when we have what is called jhana. So when we sit and meditate, and then the mind is in the state of primordial wisdom, it's not like normal waking consciousness. It's not like sleep and dream. So there we're in the jhana bardo, because we're in between finishing our meditation session and going back to everyday consciousness, and then sleep and dream. So it's a possibility for very good Buddhist practices that through Mahamudra training, there will come a time after shamatha and vipassana practice where we awaken, we kind of break through to Buddha mind, and we can simply be that for a while. So these are the three bardos in normal human existence, three possibilities. Waking state, sleep and dream, profound meditation. We call it realization. And then there are three more related to dying in general. So Bardo number 4, where consciousness is not like it is in sleep, in the waking state, or in deep meditation, where it is very particular, is when at the end of life, the constitution of our body and mind, and the way body and mind interrelate, starts breaking up. It's when the elements, the earth, water, fire, wind, space elements of the body fold up, one dissolving into another, and they produce within consciousness, which is what we're looking at, unique experiences. So sometimes we study that in detail. Some of them happen before clinical death, some of them happen afterwards. So that's called the Dying Bardo, when this life, this precious human existence, which is a composite created by karma, starts to fall apart. The 5th Bardo is again unique in its own way. It is the usually translated as clear light Bardo or clarity Bardo, which is when the mind leaves the dead body. There is a moment where it's possible to dissolve into the everything, the pure Buddha mind. There's a possibility of achieving Dhammakaya. So that's the clarity or clear light Bardo number 5. For many people, for most people, because they don't have meditation experience, it lasts about a second. And if they've had, it depends how long you can remain in primordial wisdom while you're living and meditating, how long it lasts. Anyway, that's details. And then there is the 6th Bardo, which most people call the Bardo, which are all of the 49 days of experience between the end of one life and the beginning of the next, when from time to time there are moments of clarity where we could dissolve into the Sambhogakaya aspect of Buddha. And then we get back to rebirth, which is not it's not included, because then you're back in waking state consciousness and so on. But rebirth, while we're on the list, is the opportunity to integrate with Nirmanakaya. So the 6 Bardos is a whole teaching. It's really very, very interesting. I hope one day you have the chance to explore it. And it's something I've had the pleasure of teaching a few times. Very, very useful. So now we've zoomed out from the 2 layers that run parallel, Buddha mind, the stream of consciousness, both of which are included in the word chitta, mind, the truth of mind, and the deluded stream of consciousness of mind. Now we see that deluded stream of consciousness has 6 main possibilities we call the 6 Bardos. So now we zoom into the waking state consciousness of that, where we studied last week how in the waking state we are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and then based on our history of all of those things as we were conceived and grew up, then we can think about those things, remember them. We learned language, we learned ideas, so we can toy with ideas. But when we look closely at language and ideas, it all rests on the five senses. You give a child a rattle, and you say, rattle, 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 and after a few weeks it knows rattle, rattle, and it can say rattle, and the rattle's got its own rattle reality. The six consciousnesses. Now, today, we need to go on to the 8 consciousnesses. And as I explained at the end of last week, it's not that there are 2 new consciousnesses. You remember that added to the traditional 6. So if you remember, the 6 were seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and physical sensations like heat and cold and nervous sensations, hunger, pain, blissfulness of body, well-being. 5 senses. And then remember, the arm was compared to the mental consciousness, which filters them and can only receive one of those at a time. So if you're really listening to what somebody's saying on the telephone, you're not looking anymore, you're not smelling anymore, your saucepan's boiling on the gas and you don't even know, you can't even smell it because you're totally absorbed in what's being said, hearing consciousness. Or you're so absorbed with the tasting consciousness because you're cooking lunch that you can't even hear what people are telling you. Our mind prioritizes mental consciousness, prioritizes. And then sometimes it leaves the senses to think about things, to imagine, to dream, to reflect, to compute. So we have mind and then all of these mental activities, peripheral mental activities, remembering, thinking, making decisions, and in particular, when we study them, virtue and non-virtue, which are key players. But now, this 6 consciousness, we need to look at 2 aspects of it that are so powerful that they're worth taking out and giving separate names, although they are only part of 6 consciousnesses. It's not something other. Now, to explain that, I'm going to go and be a bit silly examples that I hope give you some clue. This is not a technical, long, sophisticated Buddhist philosophical analysis of consciousnesses 7 and 8. We don't have time. It's a bit of fun, which might help us to get it. So in your course material, first there is the six consciousnesses we had last week. And then there's another diagram, and mine's not very clearly printed because I had printer problems. That's this one. Oops, get it in front of the camera. That's about the 8 consciousnesses. Now, you can see we've got, similar to last week, we've got this same diagram of the 6 consciousnesses and mental consciousness and these mental events. But now we've got number 7, which is a jester who's got his own little apartment. And then number 8, which is a huge warehouse. So 7th consciousness is called defiling consciousness. And the 8th consciousness is called storehouse consciousness. And let's look at those today and quickly work out how they work in this never-ending play of consciousness. First, let's go to the eighth consciousness. Now, this is called Alaya Vijnana. Alaya Vijnana. Vijnana, we saw last week, means consciousness. And Alaya means basis. I don't know if you're going to come across this, but I do need to just do a bit of language very briefly, because it can be confusing in the texts. Alaya means basis. When it's linked with Alaya Vijnana and basic consciousness, it's what we're talking about today. It's the warehouse consciousness that we have, the power of our mind to hold like an endless cupboard, like an endless storehouse. Stuff created by our past experience. Not just in this life, but in all the previous lives. Well, not quite. We might get time to come to that, but anyway, a lot of stuff. It's like in a theatre, all the costumes for all the plays that those actors can perform. All the things that you'll be doing in this life, or you might do in future lives, the next lives. The programming is somewhere there in our minds. It's invisible. That's a nuisance. It will be so good if we could just plunge in there and check it out, but it's there. And when we trigger it, it comes out. So this eighth storehouse consciousness is Alaya Vijnana, the basis from which the moment by moment experience is drawn. It's like all the stuff in your computer that enables you to look at pictures or to do your family accounts. It's all in there somewhere, and it can come up depending on how it's triggered, how it's evoked, the storehouse. But the word alaya, without vijnana next to it, is also used in our very profound teachings. And there it's not alaya vijnana, this basic quality of ever-changing consciousness. It's alaya, the pure basis, the pure nature of our mind, the primordial nature. Now that can get very confusing, as you can imagine. Sometimes in the text you see kunshi in Tibetan, kunshi, or alaya, and you have to go and ask your teacher if it's not glaringly obvious. Excuse me, sir, alaya. Does this mean Buddha mind in all of its purity, the basis of everything? Or does it mean the basic storehouse of Ken's consciousness, the basic storehouse of your consciousness, which is not the same, where all of your data, your personal data, is stored? It's good. These days we've got much more possibilities in language than they had in the past. So now we've got the idea that there is this storehouse. Now, how did stuff get in there in the first place? That's karma. When we're making karma, we make mind habits. We make karma with each other. And depending on the strength of that karma, the karma we make with each other leaves an imprint, and that imprint is able to produce results in a later life. So just now, as you go through today, and you interact with people, and your mind goes through its habits of thinking, we are reprogramming all the time, what's in that storehouse. We can study that. That might take quite a few hours or days. But let's just see that storehouse that is personal. My storehouse is not the same as your storehouse. My storehouse, created by me in all my past lives, and in particular this life as well, is unique. And that's why it gives rise to my unique experience, minute by minute today. Yours gives rise to yours, with all the things that present themselves to your senses into your imagination. So now we have a little idea of that storehouse, the fact that our mind contains this huge array of possibilities created by the past. Then consciousness number 7, called the defiling consciousness. What is that? Well, consciousness number 7 has 2 functions. One is it's consciousness number 7 that pulls the next moment out of that storehouse. So I put a jester, I'm going to get that word right, jester here. Funny way of presenting 7th consciousness. It's like 7th consciousness takes away the previous moment, puts it back in the box. So let's think of storehouse consciousness as the box, and it pulls out the next moment. So it's like a jester with masks who goes, enough of that one. Woohoo! Look, I'm Superman. Enough of that one. Woohoo! Look, I'm Mona Lisa. Woo! Enough of that one. And the next one. In a very short moment of time, faster than we can perceive, there is this take away the previous moment, bring on screen the next moment, take that away, bring on the next moment, take that away, bring on the next moment. How fast does it happen? Well, they didn't have stopwatches with hundredths of a second and so on in the time of Buddha. So in the old scriptures, we have the most marvelous analogy. I love it. So it goes like this. You know, a mushroom has gills underneath. Now, it doesn't say what type of mushroom, what species, but a mushroom with gills. You take 100 mushroom gills, so you cut them out from a mushroom, and you put them in a stack. And then you compress the stack onto a surface. And then you take a very sharp needle and you pierce the stack. It doesn't say how fast or how many joules of energy you expend. But so then the time it takes for the needle point to go from one mushroom gill to the next as it goes through the stack, it says it's roughly the time it takes for consciousness number 7, the jester to go woohoo and bring on the next moment. So I'm sure if you've meditated, you've seen your mind jumping around. One moment you're in sacred space and you're thinking of Chinrezig, and then the next moment you're wondering about cat food or something. It just goes from one thing to another, one thing to another. And it's totally bonkers, actually, until we get some kind of grip on it with meditation. And we need to accept the fact that we're bonkers when we start meditating. Otherwise, it would be very disturbing. And often people who are learning, they come to people like me, meditation teacher, and they think they're very weird, or that they should normally be put in a lunatic asylum and everyone else is sane, until you tell them no, it's like that for everybody. It's the way 7th consciousness works. So with that rapidity, one function of the 2 functions of 7th consciousness is to bring on screen and take off screen. It programs our experience. Now that programming in itself is a habit. And the beauty of meditation, the beauty of Dharma, is that we learn through shamatha, and we learn through learning, like we're doing now. We learn how to work on the habit so that the mind doesn't automatically go where it used to go. And we learn to rechannel it. We learn to cut through sometimes. We have all sorts of very skillful techniques. Sometimes we let the normal mind babble, just be submerged by devotion and presence. Many, many ways in which we change the way our jester is functioning. So that's one thing, bringing on, taking off. But the other thing that seventh consciousness does is to automatically, until our mind is very deep, split the next moment that it's taken out of eighth consciousness storehouse into seemingly two sides, an experiencer and something experienced. And this is why Buddha says it's like a dream. He was not just being poetic, not just, it's like a dream. And so that we have some kind of don't take it too seriously attitude towards life. What happens if you dream of an ostrich? Does an ostrich come into your bedroom? Do you astral travel to the psychic land of ostriches and experience one? The ostrich is as much your mind when you're dreaming as the you in the dream who's, oh, an ostrich, what are you doing here? It feels like two sides. You feel so much like an experiencer, and out there's a whole world in the dream, the ostrich. So just as both of them are your mind, and when you look very closely into that mind, you can't really find this side and that side. Actually, it's just in the mind, there's ostrich image. But we feel like, oh, I'm seeing an ostrich, or maybe smelling an ostrich. So seventh consciousness makes what is called the dualistic split. Every time what is just one mind moment becomes, in feeling, split into two sides, dualistic split. So that's duality in one of its meanings. But based on that dualistic split, then we get dualistic thinking. Now the split happens for all sentient beings in the six realms, whether they have words, whether they have associations, cognitive processes like we do or not. So the me and it feeling will be there for a rabbit, as far as grasses and meadows and places and offspring are concerned. The split is there. But then what we humans do is put labels and definitions. We talk to ourselves about ourselves. We talk to ourselves about not just a flower, but we know that's this type of flower, and then we know and we know and we know. And so some people are quite botanical experts, and they say, well, I suppose you could say it's a daisy, but actually it's not just a daisy. You say, this is the species of daisy you only find in the north of Wales, and it's called so-and-so, so-and-so. And then you get a whole load of history, which means if somebody with that mindset sees a daisy like that, they can't stop all that stuff coming up at the same time because it's there in their storehouse. Eighth consciousness. But there are labels. So seventh consciousness makes the raw split, just that. And it's sixth consciousness that carries on with that and starts the cognitive recognizing, oh, this is of that, telling stories. I had one of those when I was a boy or whatever. That's sixth consciousness that does the talking, the dualistic talking. Seventh consciousness only makes this raw sensation of two sides. That's it. It doesn't describe this side or that side. It just splits. And this is happening every single moment of consciousness, right up until what we call the eighth bodhisattva level. You're nearly Buddha before that disappears. So even when you feel oneness, there's you feeling oneness, albeit very subtle, albeit very subtle. So there we've got our reservoir, our karmic potential, all of the possibilities you carry and I carry. Eighth consciousness. Seventh consciousness is pulling them onto screen one after the next, and it's splitting them into two. And then that's happening all the time. The eighth consciousness always there, seventh consciousness always working, even in deep sleep. We need to look into that. We don't have time here, but even in deep sleep, always working. And then the 6 consciousnesses are the moment by moment details. They vary all the time. So I wanted to cover those topics briefly today. Now there's one more, and I've got about 3 minutes. So I'd like to bring that in if I can. Now this one's a bit, what do you say, less well known in the Buddhist world. And as far as consciousness goes, it's quite important and very much related to this process of the 7th consciousness, which is pulling things out the box each moment. And it's about causes and conditions. Causes and conditions. Now, very interestingly, a lot of people skip this. When we actually train for Mahamudra and deep teachings, we have what we call 4 common foundations, 4 ways of changing the mind. And then we have 4 special foundations where people do prostrations, refuge, bodhicitta, vajrasattva practice, mandala offering, and guru yoga. And then we have 4 extraordinary foundations. A lot of people skip those, which are about understanding this 4 conditions for experience. 4 conditions for experience. So there is, and we'll come back to them because Karmapa's verses go into them in quite some detail. He gives them importance when we come into the next verses. There is a basic condition, which means the raw material for the experience is all in place. So, what can we take as an example? It's short of an example. Anything. Cooking, smelling food, let's say. Cooking, smelling food. So the food's there, your nose is there. The ability to smell is there. Everything's in place for the experience. In larger terms, it means 8th consciousness and 7th consciousness are there. You've got the stuff in your own storehouse from the past, and the 7th consciousness is there, able to bring that on screen, able to bring it on screen. For instance, some of the stuff in our 8th consciousness, past life memories, 7th consciousness can't bring it on screen just yet. If you want to remember your secondary school, 7th consciousness can bring that on screen. That's in your storehouse consciousness, those memories. But deeply seated memories from previous lives, they're there too. But it might take a lot more before they can be. So the stuff for the experience is in place. That's the basis of consciousness. So now the food, and we're looking at one moment of smelling food. First is the subject condition, which is you have a nose able to smell. So there's a subject condition this side. That's number 2. Number 3, an object condition. The food with its odor is there. So general, everything's there. And then more particularly out of the everything, you have a nose that can smell, and there's an odor waiting to be smelled, capable of being smelled. Then the 4th condition is called the triggering condition, whereby you think, I should smell that food now. I've been cooking it for 10 minutes. I should see if it smells right. So that triggering condition, maybe you were looking at your phone and checking your messages while you're cooking, and then all of a sudden you think, oh, I should see how it's getting on, taste it or smell it. Something triggers that moment. Now that's seventh consciousness. That one's seventh consciousness at work. So 4 conditions, I just mentioned them today. And when we come to the Karmapa's text and verse by verse, then he'll explore them in terms of consciousness, because the first section of his work is about consciousness. When we do the 4 extra special foundations, the 4, they're called extraordinary foundations, we look at these 4 conditions in terms of what will make your Mahamudra journey work or not. What will make it come on screen as a reality in your life. Inside you, there's a devotion. Inside you, there's the willingness. Inside you, there's the karmic potential. Outside of you, there is the guru, there is the lineage, there is the power of the teachings. And then the triggering condition is the diligence, the intensity that makes you decide to go back and to practice and give more of your time, more of your day to that. So it's very important in terms of our spiritual journey to understand those 4 conditions for Mahamudra, the depth of realization, Buddha nature, awakening, and to see, once we look into those conditions, what can get into the way and become an obstacle, so that you're not so inclined, you get busy with worldly life and so on, and it's very hard to pull yourself back, or the teachers not available, and so on and so on. So the 4 conditions and their obstacles become very important, but in this text we're looking at them in terms of the way, but we will look at them next week, the way consciousness functions. So there we go. That's it for this week's formal teaching. Now we'll stay together for another 20-25 minutes if you've got any points you'd like to make. But let's dedicate the teaching part first. Share it with all of our fellow beings and dedicate it to our own awakening. Sonam die tamche zikpani, tomne nyepe dranam pomchene, jegana che palak trukvani, sibe sole provago parashu. Thank you. So if you want to say anything,